Our next guest speaker is Mr. Jan Matthews, Regional Manager for Ground Labs. Jan, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So in this presentation, we're going to have a look, using some real-world examples, about how effective data management can be put in place in the context of a large amount of data, exponential data growth, and really complex technological environments. And we're going to look at how an evidence-based approach for a continuous cycle of data identification and verification and remediation can form the basis for effective data management, but also complying to global privacy legislation and meeting security standards. But before we do that, it's worth having a look at why this matters and how we came to be in the situation in the first place. According to IDC, in 2021, 79 zettabytes of data were generated worldwide. That's 79 million petabytes of data. And by 2025, that number will have grown to 180 zettabytes. IBM are saying that over the next 2 years, more data will be generated than has been generated to date in the whole history of data collection. Now, not all this data will be retained, but the data that's stored is growing at a rate of 19.2% year on year. So there's a lot of data out there. Historically, organizations collected data without a great deal of control. They just didn't have a lot of data analytics available, but they thought, let's collect this data because it may come in useful someday. A bit like collecting empty bottles and jars, just in case they might be useful. As the cost of data storage came down, they collected more and more data because it's going to be really useful. We'll have it there when we need it. And because of this low cost of data storage, there was no incentive for them to clean up and tidy up the amount of data they had. And in consequence, they developed vast data lakes. And as these data lakes got bigger, the visibility of the data, where it came from, where it is, what it's there for, that diminished. And the distribution of that data became wider and wider. If we move a little bit more up to date, then the increasing rate of technology change has made that situation even more complex. Also, over the last 3 years, all of our businesses have been through an extraordinary time. Because of enforced lockdowns and a move from office to home-based systems, there's been a rapid acceleration of digital transformation programs. McKinsey reports how digital transformation programs that were supposed to take years have just happened in months. On top of that, organizations have outsourced many of their operations, platform as a service, software as a service. And this has meant increasingly complex supply chains and even more wide distribution of the data. And as organizations have grown to support their clients and customers, so the high-risk data that they're collecting has also increased. So let's give a few real-world examples of this risk around collecting data. The first is an organization that had their main business application had a performance issue. So the system administrator turned on verbose logging as part of his troubleshooting. And this application was all of a sudden putting all of the PII that was being processed within it into the data logs in the clear. The next step was the system administrator forgot to turn off the verbose logging. All of a sudden, all of that PII, and this included cardholder data, was kept in the clear for months. And the organization didn't have any effective systems for discovering where they were keeping data, and they were really exposed during that period. Here's another example, a large telco. They were undergoing a security assessment, and the independent security assessors wanted to examine some financial systems that they thought were of interest to them. The organization itself was trying to steer them into the direction they wanted to go and away from these systems. And they said, you won't find anything there. You're wasting your time. The assessor said, well, it's not we don't believe you, we just want to verify. It turned out there were 100 million records of PII contained in that system. And the reason was that the organization's bank had actually been transferring statement files to that system, which contained all of the personal data of the people on those statements. So what's clear is that it's really critical for us to build data awareness. What data have we got? Where did it come from? What purpose does it serve? But how do we go about building that data awareness? And the first step in that process is to identify what data the organization is actually holding, but also what information is important to that organization to meet its goals. Secondly, to verify what the purpose is of the data and what its value is to the organization. Based on that, they can keep the data that they need and dispose of the data they don't need. And then the organization can concentrate its resources and its money and its time on actually protecting the data that's important to them. And this CIA triad that many of you may be familiar with is a way of ensuring the correct remediation takes place on these systems. With that in place, you can then set up the controls that you need to manage the data based on its sensitivity, based on security frameworks, and based on industry standards. But the biggest challenge, I think, that we find is how do organizations get a clear view of the data they've got? Very often, that is based on data flow diagrams. So the organization creates a data flow diagram. It's based on where different people in the organization think the data is and the data should be. It defines the flows and the processes between individuals and departments and third parties. But it's based on an assumption. So the organization believes it knows where its data is. They believe they've got the processes in place to manage that data. But what they haven't taken into account, perhaps, is the unknown, what lies beneath the tip of that iceberg. And if you do an evidence-based data discovery, they would find that there's data that they're just not expecting in places they're not expecting it. That can come about through a number of reasons. We've already spoken about how just people going about doing their day-to-day job have inadvertently exposed data in places it shouldn't be. But it could be where a system fails, or it could be where a process is taking too long, or an individual is finding a task too onerous, and they take shortcuts. And these shortcuts and human errors can rapidly increase the amount of data that is in places it shouldn't be. We already talked about the data lakes, but there are vast reservoirs of data that were created from, say, a badly executed decommissioning of a system, or a rapid data migration where vast amounts of data have been duplicated unintentionally. And so once you dig beneath the surface with evidence, you see there's a lot more than meets the eye. It's very important for an evidence-based system to be able to achieve a number of things. So it needs to look at all of the data types that an organization has and the different formats of data. It should be able to examine on-cloud as well as on-premise as well as cloud environments. It should look at structured and unstructured data. And it should be able to examine email files and images. All of these places are important. Also, it really should give some form of remediation capability where it can delegate the remediation to the different departments within the organization. Once that data is discovered, we move to the evaluation stage, which is about what data do we keep and what data do we dispose of. And this is a team effort. This is collaboration amongst different departments to make sure you're getting an all-round view of what data is important, where it should be kept, and what you can then dispose of. And it also gives a prioritization for your remediation steps. Once you've carried out that identification and verification, you're now in an informed position. You know what data to keep, what data not to keep, what data needs extra protection. And then that informs you in re-engineering your processes, updating your systems, and putting in the controls that you need to manage the data. And it gives the baseline for a data strategy that enables you to manage data throughout its entire life cycle until disposal. But one important aspect is that this should not just be a one-off process. It's really important to repeat this process on a regular basis and improve and enhance your data management. Every day there's new information comes into an organization. There are regularly new threats that they face, and there's frequently new legislation. So unless that cycle is continued on a regular basis, you very soon come out of date, you lose visibility, and you have then subject to the consequences that that brings. And a final thought on this is automation is really important. Without automation, organizations won't have the resources and time to carry out this cycle effectively. Automation also helps with the data remediation steps. And with an automated system, you will be also generating reports. And those reports can help with data assessments. They can help with security certification. They can analyze your risk. They can keep you in line with all of the data legislation and privacy legislation that's there. So in summary, we've looked at how historic data collection and rapid digital transformation has led to this growing volume of data and a real challenge in managing these unintended repositories. We've looked at how this identify, verify, protect cycle can help you deal with that. And finally, how establishing this as a regular process is the path to effective data management. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much. Very fruitful insight. And honestly, I heard in various conferences, people are coming and say, data is the new oil. So I'm wondering. So the question is, considering the fact that we are already collecting like zettabytes, I cannot imagine that number of data. Do you think we are utilizing the data in a proper way, in a best way to, get this business decisions, for instance?
Yeah, that's interesting because data is the new oil, but it depends which side of the fence you're looking at it from. That vast amount of data can also be a huge liability to your organization. So in order to derive the maximum value, it is so important to have the control over that data, to know where it is, and what its value is, so that you are actually focusing on the benefits of the data, but minimizing the risks surrounding holding that data. And those risks, they can be compliance risks, or they can be security risks, because if your data is in places you don't know, then it's in threat of being breached.
That means that we need to have a sort of data strategy, exactly what you mentioned into. Who would be the owner of a data strategy in a company? Who would lead this process? Identification, classification, and so on and so forth, the entire process.
It's very widespread. And one of the challenges is there very often isn't just one owner because of this collaboration. The data means so much across different areas. So we find CIOs to have a high-level view of it. We find CISOs have a very strong view on security. We find data protection officers are very interested in the data protection. But it falls into so many departments. So the architects of the systems need to be involved because they're actually designing the systems that are responsible for where that data lies and where you can find it.
I think, starting with the GDPR, I think from that moment, companies started to look at the data more carefully than they've done previously, just because of the, being compliant with the GDPR. Is that correct?
That is true. But some companies are still saying, we'll take the risk. We'll take the risk of breach, we'll take the fine, we're not going to bother about it. And I think people should be aware that it's not just about compliance, it is about the security of the data. And if there's a breach, that organization, the reputational damage can be huge. Some organizations have gone completely out of business because of the loss of reputational damage. So yes, be compliant, but think beyond the compliance. And I think today's talk is about effective data management. It's not just about compliance or even just about security.
So my understanding is that Ground Labs could support us in performing this kind of process, putting order in data, right?
Absolutely. We focus on that discovery phase and the remediation and the risk analysis. So what we saw as foundational to what we're doing for data management, that's the bit that Ground Labs can help with.
Thank you very much. Jan Matthews, Regional Manager, Ground Labs.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, we're moving forward.